I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and here today with me is Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer at StoneX. Thank you so much for being here. Great to have you back.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me back. It's things have been a little hectic in the fertilizer market here recently, so it's getting a little bit of attention globally speaking.
It really is. And as I was telling you before we turn the camera on, we don't get a chance to talk about fertilizers very much on our channel. But I thought just with all the headlines, everything going on in the world, it's valuable to cover this sector. I'm hoping we can start a little bit basic. So I think everybody's probably been hearing about the Iran war impact on fertilizer prices and supply. But when we're hearing that, can you tell me what fertilizers are we actually talking about there?
Well, of the three majors, which is nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, this is impacting two of them. And most of the global attention is getting spent on nitrogen. That makes sense because 3 of your 10 largest exporters of the world of urea sit behind the strait, as do 3 of the 10 top exporters of anhydrous. So that has really been the main focus. But we think an underreported story out there is actually phosphate. Saudi Arabia is one of the top 5 manufacturers and exporters of phosphate, and of course they're stuck behind the Strait of Hormuz. But that seems to be where we're kind of spending a lot more of our focus. But like most things, it's expanded from just the thing you look at. Now we're starting to look at, the lack of LNG exports, which is affecting other nitrogen production fertilizer around the world. We're looking at the lack of sulfur shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, which is hurting other phosphate producers around the world. So what started as not a small story, right, but it was a largely condensed and targeted story of just the Persian Gulf, well, now it's starting to spread out and start to hit other industries and have bigger impacts.
It does seem to be spreading further and further. And that's another point I wanted to go over with you, just to give us an idea of the scale of what's happening. Have we seen an event like this that's impacted the fertilizer space before? Is this comparable to anything else you've seen?
No, it's not even a close second. The only thing you can really point to was back in 21-22. We had European production that shut off because, of course, they got into a tiff with Russia on the Nord Stream pipelines, and Russia eventually shut off the pipeline flows, and so they blew it up, and European production suffered. And during that same time, Russia moved into Ukraine, and we started to see a lot of the world pull back, and we thought, truly, we're going to lose Russian exports of fertilizer, and we saw prices skyrocket. At the end of the day, we did lose European production. That was a very real thing. And Europe produces around 15 million tons of urea per year. But the Russia thing was more emotion. It was a belief. It was the fear that we were going to lose it. The Middle East alone, those 3 countries, Qatar, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, combined for 13.5 million tons per year exports. And that's on top of Europe, still 3.5 million tons behind. That's on top of China, not exporting until at least August this year. And they usually export 5 to 5.5 million tons. That doesn't include the lack of LNG exports that usually flow into India, the world's second biggest urea producer. They produce 30 plus million tons per year. We believe their production rate today is somewhere between 50 and 60% of normal. So this is far, far worse of a situation. And the calendar is also working against us. A lot of the Northern Hemisphere and in places like Australia preparing for their spring applications. This could not happen at a worse time on the calendar.
So this is really sounding quite massive. We've got so many areas that are important for fertilizer production being impacted. Are there other producers, countries around the world that can step up to increase their production, or does that simply take too long, or we're not capable of it?
Not capable of it. If a production plant today has the capability to run at the current economics, and a lot of them can, they're already maxed out their production. This is for the manufacturers who have got cheap and stable gas inputs, and they're able to price their finished good on all these global problems. These are margins that they have never even been able to conceive before. So they're producing everything they possibly can. Now, we do look to Europe. There is production offline there. They're producing about 75% of normal. So in theory, you could ramp up those plants. You could get those offline plants back and operational. But again, we don't see that happening. Their gas price continues to rise because they are so closely linked with that Middle Eastern area. So the cost of production continues to go up at a rate much, much faster than what the finished good price is.
So we've already seen price increases, significant price increases for the impacted fertilizers. Can you talk a little bit more about the scale of those increases and what happens from here? Because it sounds like perhaps they'll only keep rising until we see some kind of resolution.
Yeah, so I went back and looked at these numbers earlier today. And again, I'm going to talk NOLA, New Orleans, Louisiana, urea barge market, because that's the most liquid, it's the most visible market in the entire world. A lot of people struggle with it, and I always say it's like an SAT question. NOLA is to fertilizer as Chicago is to corn. So that's our base point. And going back to February 27th versus where we are today for April loading physical barges, the price is about 50% higher. But to give it a little bit more scope, if you go back to December 12th, and this was before India stepped in a month earlier than what was expected for their purchase tender, the price has doubled. So it is up significantly. It was already going up before the war started. The war just put it in overdrive.
So again, very significant impact here. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about who the buyers are right now that are having to contend with these high prices. What are the main countries that are the importers?
You can basically point to about every country in the Northern Hemisphere, and they're preparing for their spring season, right? We're all coming out of wintertime. We're all moving into spring, and this is when you start planting, you fertilize. There are countries that are a little bit ahead of schedule, which I would put North America in that. There are countries that we think are going to hurt a little bit, like maybe in Eastern Europe. Australia, of course, getting ready for their application season here, coming up fairly shortly. We think they're probably a little bit danger. Asia could be in a little bit of a danger. But that's one of the things that we have been kind of bucking the trend. Everybody's talking about, global food shortages. North America farmers they're not going to have enough. We actually feel the supplies are in very good shape. We need about 1 million ton April, May imports in order to meet our needs. And frankly speaking, looking at the April vessel lineups that we're tracking, we think we've already got about 400,000 or 500,000 tons lined up of the 1 million ton that we need. So that's all to sit there and say we don't think there's a major supply problem for North America, but there is an affordability problem. That could be; those are two completely different terms. Something can be available but not affordable. I'd love to go buy a Ferrari. It's available; it's just not affordable to me.
Yeah, I see the difference there. And just talking a little bit more about supply, alternate places where supply can come from. I've also seen in the news about China and perhaps Russia as well restricting exports of fertilizers. Can you weigh in on what exactly is happening there?
So the China situation is nothing new. They did pop back into the market, and this is what got everybody into a tizzy, and it was that China was locking down all the fertilizers. What they were actually doing is they were locking down all of the smaller fertilizers. Before we even got into 2026, the government had come out and said, we will not allow the export of urea or phosphate until August 2026. We're going to keep these tons at home for our farmers. We're going to ensure adequate supplies and lower than the world pricing. And so we already knew they were not going to be major exporters of the two major products. But what they did recently is come out and say, okay, no fertilizer products can be exported. SSP, sulfur products, any of those kind of things. So it was just basically, we were already doing most of them. We're just going to make sure everything stops. It's easier to put a full stop on it and then let a few pieces go. But yeah, I mean, China, easily the world's biggest phosphate producer and exporter. They don't exist. China, for urea, they are typically the world's second or third biggest exporter. They don't exist.
I think for many industries, not just fertilizer, this war situation that we're seeing right now is raising questions about dependence on other countries for materials. So I'm wondering for you, when you look at the fertilizer space, do we need to see more diversification? And do you have any thoughts on what that could actually look like?
I think yes, and I hope that looks like us producing more of our own goods. When we look at nitrogen, we produce most of our own anhydrous that we use, most of our own UAN. But urea, again, we import 5. This year we're thinking 5.1 million is what we'll need to get through the season. There's no reason for that. We have very adequate and cheap gas supplies that can be used to produce nitrogen fertilizer. Our demand is here. Politically speaking, we are very stable as a region. Then you start to get into the environmental talk, and nobody wants to, put up new production like that because, we want it cleaner and this and that. Somebody in the world is going to produce this, and we can do it at a higher environmental standard than a lot of the rest of the world can. So just because it's not in your own country doesn't mean it's clean. So I'd rather all these things to sit there and say, one thing I hope with all the storm clouds we're dealing with, one silver lining is that we as a nation, we as a North America, will consider producing more tons here, reduce that dependence on the rest of the world.
Are we seeing conversations about that start happening yet? I know for the broader metals sector, we're seeing fast tracking, etc. Is that also happening in terms of fertilizers or not quite yet?
Unfortunately, not quite yet. We've not seen any announcements. And, It's very difficult, right? Fertilizer is not exactly the place that everybody sprints to go invest money. And if we're going to build a world scale facility, one that produces millions of tons per year, it's billions of dollars, probably somewhere in the range of $3 to $5 billion, depending on what all you're doing. Weaver, Iowa was the most recently built nitrogen facility, and they just recently sold it for I think it was like $3.4 billion. So it's a lot of money. And for the companies that have that kind of cash, there's a lot of opportunity out there. And they probably look at nitrogen fertilizer and say, yeah, that's probably pretty low on our list. There's a lot of other things I can go invest in.
Right, right. So those high costs and I assume the long timelines as well that we know so well in the mining industry, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If you and I just had the money and we decided today we're going to build one, we're going to do it, we're going to be the people, that first ton won't be produced for years.
All right, all right. I want to go back to what you were saying about the farmers, the people who are actually buying fertilizers right now. Mm-hmm. So they can get it, but the prices will be high. So I wonder if you can talk about the decisions that farmers might be making right now, any strategies that they might be following right now, and what the impacts down the line could be there.
Yeah, if they haven't already secured their needs and they haven't already planted their crop, they can still make changes. There is no reason to sit there and say, oh, like my family farm. Now, fortunately, we've got all of our nitrogen, phosphate, potash applied. All we've got to do is plant the crop. But if we didn't, we could sit there and say we're normally a 50-50 rotation, 50% corn, 50% beans. And we could shift that more to beans if their economics proved it right. We could shift it more to corn if it looked like that was more of an opportunity. The opportunity is still there, but we are talking literal weeks until that's no longer an option. Planting will start in earnest. I mean, we're the 1st of April next week, right? Planters will be going hard. Once you put that seed in the ground, you are committed, regardless of what you've decided to do. So, yeah, it's one of those things. They've got a little bit of time on their hand, but it's not a lot of time.
That's a lot more down to the wire than I was maybe expecting to hear about. And with these higher prices and the supply issues, could we see that? I guess maybe if we could hear more about how that could play out into different crops for the coming season, how could that look?
The market has been pointing to a much higher corn acre number this year. In fact, we've been hearing a lot of people say 95, 96, 97 million acres, which is a tremendously large number. But it was one, frankly speaking, I was ready to move our number to that value. Since the start of the fertilizer year, July 1, 2025, we've been using 93 million acres. And I was ready to push my team to say, we are going to move to 95 million acres. I think that feels right. We always start conservative and build into it. This feels like it's time to go. And I woke up that Saturday morning to the news that we had struck Iran. I'm so thankful I never said a word. We have kept our number at 93. We feel very good about that number, if not even a little bit on the high side. And I think that's going to come down to, it just is going to cost so much money to plant that corn crop with all the nitrogen and everything else that you need to make it successful. It's a tremendous investment. A lot of farmers either may not have the soil that can grow enough yield potential to offset the cost, or they just may not have the money. These guys have been suffering for years, and whatever cash that they may have kind of hoarded away during those good years like 21, 22 when grain prices were solid, those are probably largely gone today.
This is along the lines of what I was wondering as well, because as you've been saying, the supply is there, the prices are high. I was curious to know how the farmers are situated. Is there a situation where the government might come in if this situation in the Middle East continues and offer assistance, or how do you see that potentially shaping up?
I do. We just actually got around farmer payments that were sent out here recently. And I think you're going to see a second round here fairly quickly. And I will tell you, personally speaking, and this isn't always popular among farmer groups and retail groups, I don't like government payments. Sometimes that rewards bad behavior. Sometimes that sometimes there needs to be a little bit of culling, even though I don't want to ever see it, but sometimes that has to happen. However, all of this is being predicated on the fact our government has caused this. The strike on Iran is the cause of this. Now, I'm not sitting there saying it wasn't right. I'm not saying anything. I'm not paid enough. I'm not smart enough to sit there and make those decisions. But it was all due to the fact of what the government has done. This is why our prices are so high. So I do think that a round of payments could be coming here fairly shortly. This is almost textbook example of why a payment should be made. And I think the government is largely considering that. I would not be surprised to see another round of checks coming out next 1, 2, 3 months.
All right, so that will be a point certainly to watch for. I think another thing that's really on people's minds right now is how are these higher prices going to eventually trickle down into food costs for people who are sitting there at home? So, is there
Mhm.
anything we can say about that at this time, or are we still too early to know?
It's still a little bit early to know. It usually takes a little while for that number to actually trickle its way down to the grocery store. But again, I still think when I look at it, a lot of people focus on corn and beans and things like that because that's centric to our marketplace. I'm more concerned about global wheat markets. The reason being, again, a lot of these places we just talked about who might struggle to get their hands on the product on time, or frankly may not have the finances to actually be able to afford it to outbid a country like the US, Canada, Europe, things like that, really, really centered on wheat. And again, they have to start making those planning decisions here fairly soon. If they can't get their hands on the fertilizer, they're going to plant it. But what the market's going to find out as we get into the summer, yield potential is not there. That yield expectation starts to fall, and we start to realize there's not a lot of excess out there. We don't have a lot of stockpile. Now your price starts to show that as it starts to tick higher.
Right, right, right. And, mentioning just because you said the word stockpile there, are fertilizers something that a country would typically stockpile? Would they have reserves of those available for a situation like this, or is that not really a thing that happens?
It's not a thing. And that has been a great conversation that folks have been having. And I like it from the standpoint we're trying to think outside the box. Like, how do we keep ourselves from getting into this situation going forward? And that gets brought up. But the unfortunate part is anybody you talk to in the supply chain is going to have stories of poor product quality. Whether that is poor because it just wasn't produced very well from whatever global production point it was coming from, whether it got into storage and got humidity, whether water got into it, whether it just broke down, maybe it just the granular isn't built for long term. There's a very high chance that that product will fail, and so it makes it very hard to have some sort of stockpile that's going to last anything more than a year or two. My counter argument to that has been, I like the thinking. I don't like it from storing product from the rest of the world. If we're going to talk about a strategic stockpile, why don't we just produce it here? Our overall problem is a lack of supply, not just domestically speaking, but globally speaking. And if we've got the capability and the capacity to produce more of it here, we can, number one, build that. We know the tons are here, so that kind of acts like a strategic reserve. We reduce that reliance on the rest of the world, and we help build supplies, which actually helps lower prices around the world.
I think that goes back again to what you were saying before. And I'm thinking about it from, again, the metals perspective, where, of course, you can build a metal stockpile fairly easily. You don't have those considerations. The other point I wanted to bring up to you is how are the fertilizer companies looking right now? We've got an investor audience. They might be looking at, all right, where can I potentially invest at this time because of this situation? So how are you seeing companies react, share prices react, anything along those lines that you can mention?
Well, I always have to watch myself because I don't have the series tests and things like that to talk stock price or give recommendations. I could give them, but unfortunately, it's going to involve an HR conversation tomorrow, and I don't want to have that. I will tell you, any nitrogen manufacturer in North America right now is loving this because again, when you start to look at the natural gas prices across the country, across the continent, they've remained very low. They're very, very affordable. We are not seeing the same price spikes that we are around the world. However, domestic urea prices are very high. UAN is very high, and anhydrous is very high. That means that manufacturer's margin is incredible today. Not to say that they were bad before, but today's profitability is just almost unimaginable. I mean, to be some of the folks in this space, they made some hard decisions to invest in some of these nitrogen production plants years and years ago, and people laughed at them. They're the ones laughing all the way to the bank today. So kind of read between the lines there, if you will.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful despite the constraints. So thank you for sharing that. We're getting toward the end here, but I do want to ask, we don't know how long the Iran war is going to last, when things may cool down over there. If the Strait of Hormuz was to open tomorrow, how long would it take the fertilizer space to normalize?
From a supply standpoint, fundamental standpoint, months, literally months. From a price standpoint, I do think you're going to see an immediate sell-off. I think that President Trump says, oh, there's been agreement, there's safe passage. I think you're going to see the sell-off. And we've actually seen that already. Earlier this week when Trump kind of talked about that, we saw a $50 a ton decrease in trade price for CFR Brazil urea futures. Somebody just immediately said, get me out of it. I'm done. I want to cash out. Now they're probably looking back and saying, I wish I wouldn't have done that. I would have made more money. But this shows you just how nervous the market is going to be. As soon as they see a reason, they're going to try and get out of these positions any way possible. But unfortunately, think about it from a straight standpoint. If tomorrow they say there's peace, well, you've got to convince you have to go out and you got to convince the vessel owners it is safe to go. Maybe 2 or 3 groups in Iran have said, yes, it's safe. We've lopped off a lot of heads off of that mythical beast, right? There could be 1 or 2 heads that are still like, I don't care what these other groups have said. We're going to attack anybody who goes through. So you got to convince the vessels to go. Well, number 2, there was attacks on Iranian natural gas production and Qatari's natural gas production. They've got to make those repairs. Number 3, you got to restart natural gas production, start getting those feedstocks into the nitrogen production facilities, and you got to get them going. But the thing that scares me the most from this timeline, the Persian Gulf was designed for a steady flow of incoming and outgoing vessel traffic. It was not designed for dozens or hundreds of vessels to show up on day one and say, load us all right now. It is a 24 to 48 hour period to bring a boat in, tie it off, open it, load it, close it, untie it, push it off. It will take time to get through this. It's going to take months before this vessel traffic gets back to normal. So even if we snap our fingers tomorrow and say, hey, it's done, it's still going to take a long time before we normalize this. So there is going to be the emotional sell-off immediately, but then I think the fundamentals of the market kind of look at it and say, okay, you guys sold off everything. Now we're going to start taking this thing back higher because we've got a lot of fundamental problems we still have to work through.
Yeah, it sounds like definitely this is going to take a long time to resolve. This has been really helpful for helping me understand the situation. Any final thoughts you would want to leave people with before I let you go? Any takeaways?
No, it's hard to believe we're in the situation we are. I think this is going to have a lot of nations around the world rethinking their approach to it. We've been in this very world-centric, everybody kumbaya, everything's fine type approach. I think a lot of nations after this are going to have a real hard look and say, is there a way we can kind of disconnect ourselves? We don't want to completely do it, but we want to have a fallback. And I think that's going to change the way some of these things look as we start going years into the future.
Yeah, definitely that long-lasting impact. Thank you so much for coming on today to go over what's happening in the fertilizer market. As I said, this is super valuable for me. I really have a better understanding now. So thank you very much.
No problem.
Of course. And once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com. And this is Josh Linville with StoneX.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave us a comment below.